Hi, David Vizard here, and you are watching PowerTech 10. If you can give me 10 or 20 minutes of your time, I will pass on many of the things that I've been able to learn in a career building high performance and race engines. Winning race engines, that is. Anyway, just give me that chance to show you what I can teach you, and I think you will find that you're well rewarded. As I've said many times before, flow figures on their own are only a relatively small part of the picture. I would say that with pretty much definite certainty that flow figures alone represent only half of the data that you need to know about cylinder heads before any decision can be made on whether or not they are going to work. So, with that said, let's get cracking on looking at our Ultra Pro superheads in terms of, we've looked at flow, we did that in the last episode. We're now going to look at discharge coefficients, port velocity, port energy, and port energy density, right? And down the road we'll also look at swirl, but I don't think it's up to speed at the moment from what I remember about the testing. So here we go. We are now going to check those factors I've just mentioned. So over to the computer. Here's our opening page. Hitting the enter button gets us to this page, our first data page. Here we provisionally enter compression ratio, bore and stroke, number of cylinders. Other criteria such as the mean port area and the CFM at peak lift are established in the calculations in the following page. Once we've entered the provisional data, we can go on and check flow test 1, which, remember, we flowed in the last episode, that is episode 62 part 2. And here is the flow data entry page. In the top left hand quarter of the page is the data that you need to enter. That's all the figures in red. Just take a moment and read those figures. Now it's very important to put these figures in. That's all the ones in red. These describe the attributes of the port and as a result allow us to combine the flow figures with these figures for some very important data on the port. As for entering the flow figures themselves, we go down the page to the bottom left hand corner of the page. We enter the observed intake and exhaust flow, that is the two columns right, and from here when we press calculate it enters the actual corrected flow figures in the two columns in black on the left. Taking a quick trip across the page to some of the output, we see that this program's unique in as much as it will give you the required intake to exhaust ratio plus the one that you have existing. That's the functional one. Along with this, on the far right, it has the mean port velocity for the intake and exhaust. But there's a lot more to this. So now we're going to move on to the next page, which was actually the first one, and look at some graphs. To do this, we return to our first data page and move across to the far right, where it says compare two flow tests as arrowed. Clicking this button will bring us to this page. Now, since we only have one curve, we're going to compare flow test 1 with flow test 1 so that we can let the program function. And here are the curves that the cylinder head produced. We've looked at these in part 2, but now we're going to deal with them in more detail and look at some of the other characteristics that this cylinder head has. As you can see, though the figures peak flow are better than 99% of the race heads out there, you'll see they didn't quite match the figures that Don Lucito got. However, we're not done yet. Let's go and look at the discharge coefficients. Now, these might just look like a jumble of curves, but they're very meaningful, and the ability to read the consequences of these curves is worth at least 20 horsepower on your typical V8 head. Note the red and blue vertical lines. These are the 0.25D lift points for the intake and exhaust. That is 400 for the exhaust, that's 0.25 of 1.6, and whatever the other reading is, 575 for the intake. The geometry for a poppet valve is such that when it reaches 0.25D lift, there is no more area available by increasing the valve lift. However, at the 0.25D lift, the flow regime changes. The bulk flow starts to window out of one side of the valve, and it does so more efficiently than when it's trying to flow from all around the valve at lifts below 0.25D. That's because the valve has moved into a lift point which develops a new bulk flow regime. In other words, the bulk flow of the gases exiting or entering the cylinder change the flow pattern dramatically to a more efficient one, as seen in the diagram here. If the discharge coefficient line doesn't start to tip up quite steeply there is not enough bias on the port, and it is not moving into that higher flow regime. Only this program will be able to tell you whether that's happening or not, period. In the following slides, what you see are some examples of a regular 20-degree forward head bias, both intake and exhaust. This is very effective at getting flow. So exactly what are the implications of the potential to get a steep upturn after the 0.25D lift point? Well, what it means is that on the exhaust, it's a steep upturn after the 0.25D indicates that the port is becoming very efficient. And with the figures we're seeing here, it's actually achieving a little over 100% efficiency when we measure the efficiency as a venturi. Right? So there's pressure recovery there. And it tells us that on a parallel valve engine, which is what we're dealing with here, that the bias on the port, that is the lean toward the cylinder wall side of the port, is good. The steepness you see on this graph here is reminiscent of a pro stock exhaust port. So what we have here is a highly efficient exhaust port. Now on the intake, there isn't very much climb in the area after the 0.25D turn. It only goes up slightly. Now that's telling us that, or what it's telling me, is that there's not enough bias on the port for it to make the most use of this window flowing over to one side. So that's something we're going to deal with. Now, This is the advantage of looking at figures other than just the flow numbers, because there are signs built into those curves that can tell you what you should be looking at next. That's not possible from just looking at flow figures. By the way, I'm going to put a little note in here. If any of you want this flow program, here's how you get it. Let's look at some conclusions we can draw here. Overall, our IOP program is showing that we do not have enough bias on the intake. The port speed is too high, it's up at 350 something. A good speed would be 300 to 320. Same goes for the exhaust. The exhaust is a little on the small side. Right, so we'll look at the bowl there and see what we can get there. It looks like we have adequate area, as the program predicts, at the manifold face. So the blockage, the lack of volume, is near the valve. It's telling us that we, at our 14:1 compression ratio, we don't have enough air to make that 1,000 horsepower quite. It's going to be somewhere between the two numbers quoted, and it's going to be nearer the one where we are limited by the Mach number of the port. That's the lower number. Now, all of these factors are things that it would be hard to conclude from just flow figures. So if you're only using flow figures to develop your heads, you're dragging your heels. This IOP program tells you all of the points that you need to address to get to that pro stock porting efficiency numbers. With Don's basic port, the design of the basic port is such that we can achieve pro stock like flow figures with this head. And that's something you don't normally get with a parallel valve head. Oh, that's good. Anyway, our next phase of the investigation of this Ultra Pro 9-degree head starts to move into territory which is what professionals should know, but very, very few of them do. So we're now moving into a pro stock technology arena, right? Now, Don's been porting heads for almost as long as I have. The only difference between him and I is I'm older than he is. Plus, he's done this head porting kind of more or less full time and focused on it to the extent where his experience on the number of high-tech cylinder heads that he's done is actually higher than mine by quite a bit. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to explain some of the techniques that can be revealed by the IOP program. I say techniques, factors. The first one that we're going to look at, and we've kind of touched on this already, is the port velocity. Now, many years ago, and I think it was a very famous research engineer around the First World War, the stuff he did was just awesome. Ricardo, right? Harry Ricardo. Now, way back when, they spent some time, his research establishment spent some time doing research into how important port velocity was. And they kind of come up with a fairly good all-round figure of 300 feet per second mean port velocity. Port velocity. Now, as it happens, that number, although it's not universal, it was very pertinent to a lot of the types of engines that we do. In my cylinder head series that I'm doing, the porting series, I'm going to delve into the speeds various types of heads need to have to be optimal, right? And for what we're doing, a typical 2-valve head needs to have a port speed as indicated by the IOP program. This does not mean that that's the one that's being operated on. I've made the program compatible with what other people have done so that it gives a reading that corresponds with what they produce, right? So I won't go into any more of that, but for the cylinder head we've got here, we need to look at speeds better than 300 feet per second, but not as high as the 350 feet per second we're seeing. I would say that we'll probably find our best results here with a port speed on the intake of around about 325 and a similar one on the exhaust. That's at full lift. Now, in practice, the exhaust velocity is way higher than 325 feet per second. It's at the gap in the valve, between the valve, it actually gets to supersonic or transonic speeds. So, but that's not our concern. We can't do anything about that. That's a natural event caused by the geometry of the engine we're working with and the combustion characteristics. What we do have to take into account, though, is not just velocity. We can always make that high by itself. We have to take into account the port's energy. Right now, the higher the port energy is, the better. But we don't have a before and after to compare with yet. So these figures won't mean much, except from experience I can say that the port energy is very strong. Now, the port energy density takes the units out of this and makes it an equivalent number to the brake mean effective pressure. I say equivalent, nothing to do with brake mean effective pressure, but that's a standard by which you can judge an engine regardless of its design. By using port energy, we can compare a 2-valve head with a 4-valve head or a 5-valve Formula 1 head or whatever, and we can compare it on a one-to-one basis. And let me tell you, that takes real porting skill. So we're going to flush through these numbers here, and I will point out what's good, what's bad, and what's indifferent. There isn't much indifferent, but it's going to give us a true direction in which I should go to try and achieve the flow figures that Don achieved on his production heads. Remember, I'm working with a set of prototype heads here that were roughed out, right? I got a very expensive set of castings that can be fixed. They may not make as much flow as Don's, but they've already shown that they've made massive flow numbers, even now when they're not done right. So if you're buying a cylinder head or a pair of these heads from Don, know you're getting something better than I've so far got. But I'm going to get a little advice from Don here and see if I can't quickly speed these ports up to what the Ultra Pro ones are. Anyway, let's take a look at our graphs. Here we go. Again, over to the computer. Well, here's our graphing page. First we select port velocity, calculate, and graph. There we have the graph of our port velocity. What these curves are telling us is that for this type of cylinder head, at these efficiency levels that we're achieving, the velocities of both the intake and exhaust ports are good. If anything, the intake's a little on the high side and maybe the exhaust a little on the slow side. From these velocity curves and our discharge coefficient curves, we can tentatively assume that we need a bit more bowl work done on the exhaust and more bias on the intake. As far as port energy goes, we don't have a before and after to compare it with, but just as a matter of reference, let me say that a typical 23-degree well-ported small block Chevy head tops out at around about 28 to maybe 30 foot-pounds of energy, which is way less than that's at 700 lift, which is way less than the 45 foot-pounds of energy we're seeing here. But let's go on to the port energy density, as that defines just how good the cylinder head is. Look at these numbers here. We're seeing at the 700, 750 range that we're using that the port energy is about 30 foot-pounds per square inch per foot of port. A good and at an inch lift, we're seeing 33 foot-pounds of energy per square inch per foot. Now let me put that into perspective. The lower end of F1 is around about 34 foot-pounds per square inch per foot. So what we're looking at here, even in its less than perfect state, is a port which is as effective in its own right as a semi-typical F1 head. Recall that I've said on numerous occasions that the IOP program tells you a lot about what you need to do to the head. It doesn't just measure flow, it gives you solid guidance of where you need to go next. Now, doing this head from Ultra Pro, we can kind of do a semi-reverse engineering to see if we take a highly successful big power producing cylinder head and flow test it to see if the recommendations it comes out with match the cylinder head that we're flowing. Well, let's just do that. Let's go and look at the information we've put in and see that how well or not, as the case may be, it tells us whether we're going in the right direction. So once again, over to the computer. Let's zoom over to the top quadrant of the page and just take a quick look at our principal entries. These aren't the only ones that we have to take care of. If we go a little toward the center, we can see that we also have to put in the intake top corner and the exhaust top corner, intake, all the way down on the second row in on what we can see. We'll go down to the area ratio. Now this is the ratio between the principal dimension of the intake port versus the valve, right? And I say the principal dimension. That's the dimension of which the bulk of the port is at on the entry before it reaches the bowl. Now, it's telling us that the entry for the area ratio for the intake is 0.807 and for the exhaust 1.181. Let's take a look and see what the program recommends. Well, we can see what this high performance head has for the statistics concerned. Now let's have a look and see how that matches up. Well, wouldn't you know, for the intake it matches up very well. 0.807 is between 0.8 and 0.9. For the exhaust we are looking at 1.2 to 1.25, and the predicted one there is 1.181. So what does this mean so far? Well, it's telling us two things. One, the program can predict what's needed as effectively as one of the world's top head porters. You'll notice that the highly successful head that we're dealing with here has the properties that the program predict. Now, the numbers are a little low on the port sizes there. That's because we haven't finished the ports yet, and they're supposed to be just a couple of more cc's bigger. If that was the case, they would fall, those numbers would fall right in the middle of the predicted limits of both the intake and exhaust. There isn't a program out there that'll tell you exactly how much intake or exhaust port you'll need, but the IOP program does. Now let's look at the next thing here, right, and that is the case of the intake ratio versus the exhaust. Now this only applies when you've used up all the room available for valves, right? So you'll notice that the figures we've got there that show up on these following graphs are very close. It'll tell you right at the top of that black section the intake to exhaust ratio we have versus the one we require. Now this 0.75 in intake to exhaust ratio only applies to an engine of around about 10 to 1 with typical valves, right? It is not a fixed number, and the compression ratio alters that ratio that is the best, and there isn't another program out there that will tell you that. So the next conclusion we can come to is that Don, with all the time he spent probing ports, flow testing them, sizing them up, seeing where the flow is going, cutting a port, then dyno testing it, pays off. But that's a lot of work. And have we got to the end of what this program will do? Heck no. There's a lot of things that I don't have time in this video to do. I've already run over the limit, but I'm going to do some new videos specifically on the program, but that's down the road. For now, I'll leave you with the fact that the part 4 of this will be how we developed the ports to try and catch up with Don's Herculean efforts to make this a power-packed head. It's nice to be able to hit that very accurate figure first time around. But let me leave you with just this one thing here. You don't want to port your own heads? It'd be hard to do better than going to Ultra Pro for any heads, right? Harley Davidson, Pro Stock, whatever. And here's the other thing, and I want to vote on this. Don's not very good at doing publicity. Since he's done such a great job supplying the industry with very functional cylinder heads, do you think I should put in an effort to promote him? I want to see your answers in the comments below.